as we get started, but we will get started. So good afternoon. My name is Ryan Shaw, and it is truly an honor for me to welcome each of you here to ASU's Barrett and O'Connor Center for what promises to be a lively and constructive discussion on competitive statecraft. I don't personally know everyone in the room, but looking around, I see some of the smartest and most dedicated public servants I do know, so I'm thrilled with the turnout. And we're here for a worthy cause. We've chosen the term competitive statecraft, but whatever term you prefer, we're here because we all recognize that we need new approaches to achieve better strategic outcomes from our foreign policy efforts than what we've got in recent years. And I know we're all united in our commitment from whatever little corner of influence we occupy to the hard thought and the hard work it will take to get them. For my part, what I can do is pull together events like this. But I can't even do that much alone, and I certainly didn't pull this together by myself. We're hosted here in Washington by ASU's Leadership, Diplomacy, and National Security Lab, and so I want to thank their directors, General Ben Freakley and Ambassador Mike Polt, as well as their tremendous support staff, led by the peerless and tireless Kathy Cook. I'd also like to note that today's event is both a sequel and a prequel of sorts. Our foundation was laid at an event last fall at Notre Dame, co-hosted by RAND, called Harnessing the Power of Democratic Society Toward a More Inclusive American Grand Strategy. Some of you were there. It was an excellent conference, so much so that we decided to do it again, and that follow-up event will be the ASU Forum on Innovating for Competitive Statecraft, which goes out west at ASU's Tempe campus on March 30th and 31st. Many of you are already registered. I trust the rest of you will be before you leave this evening. You can see me for more details on that. The panels and the speakers are shaping up very nicely, and it'll be well worth your while if for no other reason than you just can't beat the weather in Arizona in March. So, that's the past and the future, but we should try to live in the present, shouldn't we? After all, it's a beautiful day in DC in February. Who saw that coming? And this afternoon we get to hear from General McMaster in conversation first with Ambassador Polt and then with all of you. And I know we're all anxious to get started, so I'll keep these introductions brief. Ambassador Michael Polt served with distinction for 35 years in the State Department in a variety of pivotal roles both here in Washington and abroad, obviously spanning several presidential administrations. He was U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Estonia and to Serbia and Montenegro. He is now the co-founder and co-director of the Leadership, Diplomacy, and National Security Lab and serves as ASU's Ambassador in Residence. That's a peculiar title, but I can tell you that I've learned as much from my periodic conversations with him as I did from the many great poll ads I served with in my military career. He's a tremendous resource for all of us at the university, and there's no one better to lead our conversation tonight. Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster is, of course, the epitome of the soldier, scholar, public servant. His experience ranges from legendary combat operations at 73 Easting and in Talifar, to pivotal roles leading the institutional army, to publishing a seminal history of national security making during the Johnson administration, to leading national security decision making as the 26th Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs during the Trump administration. He's now a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution, and far more importantly, he's a Distinguished University Fellow at Arizona State. And while he may not even remember this, it was actually in an early conversation with him about our efforts and intentions at ASU where we settled on the term competitive statecraft. So it's really an honor to have him with us here today to discuss the concept, to set a framework for our event next month, and most importantly, to help us advance towards solutions. Gentlemen, welcome, and thank you both very much.
Ryan, thank you very much, and welcome to all of you to Charting a Secure Future for Our World. And as Ryan has already said, I can think of, all of us can think of, no one better than to help us think through this than General McMaster, and to warm us up for this enterprise that we're engaged in our forum upcoming next month in Tempe. The General is one of our country's leading strategic thinkers who has coined the term strategic competence. And it is this competence and more that we would like to discuss today as we begin to explore the importance of the integration of all instruments of power to secure America's interests and advance our values around the globe. And this afternoon, I'd like to begin to explore HR's prescriptions for achieving those goals, and then to turn to you to offer your own thoughts on how to achieve the bold aim we have outlined. As you all know, the General has some strong views on what the U.S. national security strategy should be, and I know that he expects nothing less from you in expressing yours and to ask your questions. So, as Ryan has already said, we're preparing for the Forum on Innovating for Competitive Statecraft next month in Tempe, so let's get started. And I thought that the best way to get started is to ask the General to help us in defining this term that we have coined of competitive statecraft. So, General, I was wondering whether you might just tell us what would be your definition of what competitive statecraft actually entails. Is it more than simply enhanced American military strength and readiness, onshoring of our economy and securing our supply chain, combined with national resilience and hard-nosed diplomacy, or is it a lot more than that? What would be your definition, sir?
Well, hey, thanks, Michael, and thanks to Ben for the opportunity to be here, Kathy, the whole ASU team. ASU is a tremendously vibrant place, and what I'm so excited about is the opportunity to reach so many students at ASU as well. I mean, I think in terms of competitive statecraft, strategic competence, one of the ways I think that we become more competent is that the American people demand a higher degree of competence in the areas of foreign policy and national security, and ASU is the perfect place to engage the next generation, several generations removed from us maybe, in the areas of national security and foreign policy. But I think the emphasis is on the word competitive, which gets to the interactive nature of diplomacy, the interactive nature of really advancing our national security interests. I think for too often, especially since the end of the Cold War, we didn't recognize the continuous interaction with enemies, rivals, and adversaries. And as a result, we assumed that maybe there was linear progress, right, toward a world in which great power competition was a relic of the past. Think of some of the assumptions in the 1990s that American technological military prowess would guarantee our security well into the future. Remember some of the language from the 1990s and the so-called revolution in military affairs? Everything was dominance. I mean, you couldn't read a sentence in joint concepts without the word dominant being in there. Dominant battle space knowledge, full spectrum dominance, no peer competitor till 2020. I mean, it was really loaded with hubristic language, which again really was based on the assumption that we would make linear progress toward advancing our security interests, advancing our prosperity, advancing our influence in the world. And that undermines our strategic competence. If you don't recognize the competitive nature of foreign policy and national security, first of all, if you're not in the arena, you're going to get your ass kicked, right? I mean, so if you're not on the field itself because you vacated it. But also, it's really the recognition of the interaction with enemies, rivals, and adversaries, which requires a strategy. If you're just going to do something linear, if you're just going to build a bridge, you just need a plan. If you are engaged in a competition with a determined and capable adversary or rival, you need a strategy. So I think competitive statecraft is the right term, and statecraft, I think, alludes to an element of, I think, what we're going to talk about a little bit as well, which is what is strategic competence, which is, I think, the ability to integrate all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners in a way that is synergistic and allows you to advance and protect your interests, to overcome obstacles to progress, and take advantage of opportunities.
Well, you've kicked me off very nicely to my follow-on, and that is that term strategic competence. I certainly categorically would agree with you, but I wonder if when you and I talk about strategic competence, we mean the same thing. When it comes to the confident projection of American power, I also like the current administration's call for first leading by the power of our example, as well as the example of our power. Taking that term in relation to strategic competence, what would you say to that?
I would say don't underestimate hard power, because I think this administration has underestimated hard power, and has done so, I think, in a few examples. I mean, one of them is, I think, the perception of weakness, the inescapable perception of weakness associated with the utter catastrophe in Afghanistan. And And I think that what that did is emboldened our adversaries, because if you think of deterrence as a simple, simple equation of capability times will, I think many of our adversaries, Russia included, believed that our will was zero, right? So zero deterrence. And then if you really look at the example we were trying to set to explain to Russia that, that we can allay your security concerns in Ukraine or vis-a-vis NATO and so forth. And then what we did in the lead up to the reinvasion of Ukraine in 2014 was portray, I think, extreme weakness. Withdrawing our fleet from the Black Sea, for example, listing everything that we would not do to support the Ukrainians. It was almost like we were greenlighting Russia's invasion. And then, of course, evacuating our embassy in a humiliating withdrawal, during which we destroyed tens of millions of dollars of equipment in our embassy and ran away. So I think that the failure to demonstrate hard power and to at least preserve some ambiguity on the part of Putin about how we might respond, I think were some of the reasons why deterrence failed a year ago today.
Let me follow up on that for just a moment in terms of the power of our example. I recall a military colleague of yours some time ago talking about the great importance of demonstrating the broad strength of the American enterprise, the American idea, the American presence, beyond our kinetic capabilities, to be able to demonstrate to the world that we were capable not only to have an effective hammer, but also that it's backed up by broad social consensus, by a strong economy, by all the things that make us who we are. Isn't that something that we've also neglected, in addition to not realizing the importance of the fact that you have to have a very good and effective hammer?
No, I agree. What I write about in the book Battlegrounds is this idea of strategic confidence and the need to regain our confidence based on the traumas that we've experienced in recent years. And I think we've lost kind of our swagger a little bit and our confidence in our democratic institutions and processes, really going back, I would say, to the early 2000s with the strategic shock of 9/11, but then the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. We always want to debate, should we have done it being the invasion of Iraq. I think we should debate who the heck thought it would be easy. Why did they think it would be easy in both places? And I think that the other aspect of a loss of confidence has to do with transitions in the global economy that occurred in the 2000s, especially after China's accession into the World Trade Organization in 2001. And you remember when Ross Perot was talking about the first NAFTA, and he said, there's going to be a great sucking sound. Remember, toward Mexico? Well, there was a sucking sound, except it was to China instead of to Mexico. And so those transitions left a lot of Americans behind and left them disenfranchised. I mean, I don't know how many people have seen the PBS documentary on Dayton, Ohio, for example, or read George Packer's book, The Unwinding, where you can see sort of the alt-right or whatever that reaction is, economic nationalist reaction to those transitions being really foretold there. Financial crisis, 2008, 2009. Okay, layer onto that an opioid epidemic, and now add to that as well the increasing vitriolic partisanship that we've seen, and see it super empowered as well by social media and the algorithms that pull us apart from each other, and create this phenomenon in which we're more connected to one another than ever electronically, but more distant from one another than ever psychologically and emotionally and socially. So, I mean, I think all of that's a lot, right? It's a lot to overcome, and I think we've seen it even more body blows with the assault on the first branch of government on January 6th, George Floyd's murder and the violent aftermath. I mean, it's a lot of blows in that period of time. So I think our confidence is shaken, and I think there has to be a deliberate effort on the part of our leadership, but not even wait for our political class to do this, to regain our confidence in our democratic principles, institutions, and processes.
So, not to belabor this, but just to belabor it a little bit, going back to the Obama administration, which I'm sure still today regrets the unfortunate coining of the term leading from behind.
Yeah.
Which
doesn't work in my experience.
Which, in my opinion, I would share that, and I agree it does not work categorically. But what about the intent of that being, you talk about the body blows, you talk about January 6th, you talk about the economic situation, you talk about all the things that create that lack of confidence amongst the American people. Can you regain that confidence by simply saying, we're going to beat the hell out of Putin? Or don't you have to first say, you're going to have secure jobs, you're going to have good health care, your future looks bright, your children will be able to go to school, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, how does that get combined in a total, not just total government effort, but a whole of society effort to bring us back to a point where we can be secure enough again to do all the things that we need to do to be the global leader?
Well, I do think we're underinvested in defense, and you might say, gosh, how's that possible with the size of our defense budget? But if you compare the defense budget to the checks that were sent to Americans during COVID, it's actually pretty small relative to that. I mean, and the influx of capital into our economy that did a really good job of jump-starting inflation, for example. So, I'm not an economist, but I hang out with a lot of them at the Hoover Institution. So, but I'll stop talking about the economy, but I do think that it's a false choice. I think it's a false choice. I think that we can't afford to not invest in our defense capabilities because, as we've learned, I hope, from the reinvasion of Ukraine a year ago today, is that it's much cheaper to prevent a war, than to fight one. And I think we are underinvested in defense for a number of reasons. Part of it is some of the assumptions that would have carried over from previous years, that we can just decide to do one thing at a time. In terms of threats to our national security, right? Just one major contingency operation. Well, look at really how we're set up, I think, in the coming years for potentially cascading crises. Look at the degree to which our adversaries are working together, at least to take advantage of our preoccupation in one area so that they can advance their interests in another. And this is obviously the two revanchist powers on the Eurasian landmass, Russia and China, but also Iran, which has a much deeper partnership now with both China and Russia, is helping Russia evade sanctions, providing that expertise, is selling drones, missiles, providing, I think missiles, about to be missiles, and providing ammunition to Russia, and as it continues its proxy war against us and its Arab neighbors and Israel in the Middle East. So, you could see a setup for, and then you've got Kim Jong-un saying, hey, what about me? You just fired an intercontinental ballistic missile. So I think that we have to recognize that the threats are growing. But I think, Michael, you're making a very good point as well about, what is the role of the U.S. vis-a-vis others, right? Yes. Others who have to share the burden within our alliances, for example. And I think it's kind of counterintuitive, but, under the Obama administration, you heard that we're going to lead from behind and we'll do less and then expect others to do more. I think what actually happens most often is if the United States just does a little, that our allies and partners will do a lot more. And you've seen this with everything in connection with the war in Ukraine. You saw it in Kosovo, in the Balkans in the 1990s, that it really took the United States to do something, even on the tanks issue, right? They needed the United States to provide some tanks before others would provide tanks. So I do think it's a bit counterintuitive. I think the lead from behind narrative was not helpful. I think the pivot out of the Middle East was not helpful because, hey, of course, we all realize this. There are really consequential competitions playing out in the Middle East that are quite relevant to the competition with Russia and China. And it's our proclamation over and over again, hey, we're leaving. Hey, now we're really leaving. We never actually really leave the Middle East, but by saying that, what we do is we encourage hedging behavior among even our friends and partners. And you see this happening with the Emiratis and the Saudis and others right now, is that this vacuum, this perception of the U.S. leaving, has allowed Russia to portray itself, play the role of both arsonist and fireman in the region, and of course they're hedging. These countries are hedging with China as well in terms of investments and arms procurements and drone procurements and so forth.
So, if I may, we'll talk. I suspect we're going to talk some about Ukraine today, and if we don't, then something has gone wrong here. But let me just pick up on the one point about Ukraine in terms of the U.S. leading and others to follow. In that context, would you say, from the beginning, prior to the invasion, the way we played the entire intelligence game at that time, and what we've done since, even though, of course, a lot of people have criticized the halting nature of the support that we have given. Would you say that this administration has played the game relatively well on behalf of our interests, or how would you characterize how the U.S. has acted in this particular instance?
Yeah, I think the Biden administration gets a lot of credit for really achieving a result completely opposite of what Putin thought was going to occur, which is deep divisions in the West, deep divisions in the NATO alliance, for example. And I do think that the declassification of intelligence was extremely important and helpful, particularly in taking away Putin's narrative, the narrative that this was a war of NATO aggression. As we know, it didn't deter anything, right? I mean, revealing the intelligence didn't deter Putin at all, but it did help, I think, in building that kind of cohesion within the alliance, and strengthening the voice against this brazen aggression against Ukraine. I do think that in terms of provision of defensive capabilities, it has been far too halting. But every time that they say, okay, now we will give tanks, maybe it'll be ATACMS as well, or MQ-9 Reapers, or whatever it is. I mean, I think you have to also give them credit. You can't just say, hey, you should have provided these earlier, but then not give them credit for ultimately coming to the right decision. I do think that the narrative has been off a bit on their part, with the president and some other senior officials in connection with playing into Putin's hands, right? By highlighting the concerns about nuclear escalation or an escalation of the conflict. Because this is all Putin has left, is to rattle his nuclear saber. I don't believe a nuclear weapon is usable in Ukraine. I think he knows that he is the person who should fear escalation the most. And actually, remember what he said, hey, if NATO convoys bring in equipment to the Ukrainians, I'm going to do something really bad. Okay, well, what did he do? I'm nothing. I mean, the Lithuanian army could march on St. Petersburg right now. 97% of the Russian army is in Ukraine.
So that's a fascinating concept, because I'm just trying to put my mind through this. The Lithuanian army.
I'm not saying that they should. I'm just saying that I think Putin realizes that he's in a position of weakness.
Especially since I was ambassador in Estonia, and the joke there was, when if the Moscow soccer team were to mobilize on one weekend, they would be at NATO's doorstep on that weekend. So it's interesting to think about in these terms. But something else you said brings me to my next question, and that is a term that I found fascinating that you coined, and that's called strategic empathy. And as a diplomatic practitioner, I have often found that so much of our national security policy, so much of our foreign policy, somehow is defined by how we're going to meet the threats from our adversaries. And I've always felt, well, why don't, and trying to guess what our adversaries are up to, and trying to figure them out. I remember the briefings I used to get when I was in the service about, this is the health situation of this or that foreign leader who is inimical to us, and we need to understand his or her psychology, et cetera, et cetera. Wouldn't it be better for them to have to guess about what we're up to and what our initiatives are and what we plan to do, rather than for us have to continuously trying to catch up with what they're up to? In other words, what would have been the better scenario that we could have, in a strategic sense, in a competitive statecraft environment, to prepare for before the invasion of Ukraine, or before, God forbid, the invasion of Taiwan, to go ahead and create that status of them guessing what we're up to rather than the other way around?
Yeah. Well, I think you raise a good point. I mean, strategic ambiguity has, I think, a really important deterrent quality to it. And I think that if you contrast really the response to the renewed invasion of Ukraine in 2014 to the response to the invasion of Georgia in 2008, I mean, Condoleezza Rice flew into Tbilisi. We were evacuating people, out of Kyiv, and I think that support that was shown for the Georgians up front, I mean, I think did affect Putin's strategic calculus. Plus, he actually had a lot of problems on that offensive in a very, smaller geographic area, not quite as challenging as what he took on in Ukraine. So I do think ambiguity is important. On strategic empathy, though, I do think that some of the most significant deficiencies in our policies and strategies, our approaches to our most significant national security challenges, were due to a lack of strategic empathy, or what I call strategic narcissism in the book, which is a tendency to believe that what we choose to do or choose not to do is decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome. So we think, okay, well, maybe if we just allay Putin's security concerns, that everything will be okay. Maybe if we tamp down the temperature with the China relationship, that Xi Jinping will behave in a fundamentally different way, or maybe if we remove sanctions on the Iranian regime, that the Iranian regime will fundamentally change. And I think the problem is this lack of strategic empathy, and in particular, the paying attention to the emotions, the aspirations, and the ideologies that drive and constrain the other. Oftentimes we fall into these cognitive traps, and I did not invent this term, strategic empathy. It comes from Zachary Shore, who's a phenomenal historian, whose books I highly recommend. He has a great book called Blunder, Why Smart People Make Bad Decisions. And each of those chapters is organized around a cognitive trap that you can fall into if you're not thinking about the other, and if you don't have a higher degree of strategic competence. The book Sense of the Enemy, where he writes about how to think about what's driving, constraining your rival, that's where he uses the term strategic empathy. And so if you think about Vladimir Putin, the conventional wisdom for a lot of people for a long time was that we do just have to allay his security concerns, and the John Mearsheimer view of the world, right? That it really, we offended Putin with NATO expansion, and that's why he became the person he is. Well, actually, if you read what he's been saying, actually since he took over on New Year's Day in the year 2000, he laid out his vision for reestablishing the Russian Empire. And he's reinforced that in the Munich Security Conference speech that he gave. I forget what year that was. 2012?
Yeah, 2012.
2012.
Yes.
Or then what he wrote about Ukraine in August of 2021 in the run-up to the war, or what he just said yesterday. Yes. He's been very consistent. And so Putin is, I think, a man who is obsessed. He's obsessed with a drive to restore Russia to national greatness. And he's driven mainly by a sense of honor lost during the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then I do think psychology comes into it, right? I think he's a street thug, he's a bully, and a coward all wrapped up into one. And I think when you think about your adversary, you have to take all of that into consideration. If you think about the assumption that underpinned our approach to China for way too long, right? It was that, hey, China, once the Chinese Communist Party, their leaders, once they're welcomed into the international community, hey, they'll play by the rules, and as they prosper, they'll liberalize their economy, and then they'll liberalize their form of governance. How did that one work out? Or across multiple administrations with the Iranians, going back to Brzezinski, going to Algeria to meet with the foreign minister from the revolutionary government before the hostages were taken. What did he get out of that? A hostage crisis. And then you think, well, there should be, kind of a hawk after that in Reagan. But, Reagan, part of the Iran-Contra scandal was this idea that if we sell the Iranians some weapons, the Supreme Leader's heart will grow 2 sizes bigger like the Grinch, they'll be so much nicer, and that didn't work out. And then you had even during the George H.W. Bush administration, in his inaugural address, George H.W. Bush sent kind of an olive branch message to the Iranians. How was that answered? More hostage taking. How about Hezbollah goes global, right? And conducts attacks in the Western Hemisphere and in Europe, and then President Clinton, doesn't respond to the Khobar Towers mass murder because there's a new Khatami is now the president, and he was a librarian. Maybe he'll be different, but he's the shop window for the Supreme Leader and for the RGC. I could go on about this. So when you had, and of course I could criticize the Obama administration for the whole approach under the JCPOA, or what the Biden administration has been doing, supplicating to the Iranians in a really humiliating way, I think, frankly, up until recently. So, but this is a pattern that was established over multiple administrations, and the fundamental problem was a lack of strategic empathy, not considering the ideology and the emotions and the aspirations that drive and constrain the other. And so when you don't do that, then you you fall into these traps, right, of optimism bias, of mirror imaging, right, of proximity bias and so forth.
Again, perfect lead-in. We did not coordinate this, but this is a perfect lead-in. This is wonderful. You've criticized the administration for using the term integrated deterrence to create what you call the illusion that better coordinated policies can be substituted for modernized, ready, forward-positioned forces, the argument that you've just made a moment ago. So I hear you, but couldn't integrated deterrence also be seen more positively as an integration in the context of competitive statecraft, of referring to employing whole-of-government assets to achieve national goals? Couldn't one put a positive spin on that too? But give me your criticism first.
No, I would say I agree. There is, I mean, how about, disintegrated deterrence is not good, right? And we know that. And we know that we work across purposes between different departments and agencies, and I've witnessed that, but that doesn't work really well either. Integration is really important. And, but I was criticizing what the magical quality it appears to have in the national defense strategy, and that it in and of itself can substitute for a force that's fully modernized. We have a force that has deferred a lot of modernization, based on the wars that we're fighting. We had the problem with the Budget Control Act and the not being able to have multi-year budgeting, predictable budgets. We held on to too many legacy and too much costly equipment and haven't replaced it. We have developed but have not yet fielded countermeasures to the PLA's countermeasures that we've seen them fielding in terms of tiered and layered air defense, counter-satellite capabilities, offensive cyber, electromagnetic warfare, drone and swarm drone. Those, war's a continuous interaction of opposites, right, within wars, but in between wars as well in terms of how militaries develop and field capabilities, and we're behind in that. And then I think our joint force is just too darn small. I mean, if you look at the forces that we're deploying, these little penny packets, into Europe or in the Pacific, I mean, what are they really going to do in a crisis? I mean, not enough, I don't think. And so we don't have enough ships or air wings, and I think the Army's too small. And of course, we have a recruiting issue we could talk about now as well, and maybe where that's coming from. But I really am concerned that we are not investing enough now to deter a conflict, or to be able to respond really in sufficient scale and for ample duration to fight and win. And when you look at the service secretary's strategies and priorities, it's really hard. I mean, you might even forget a little bit like what that service is for when you read them. And so I think that this should be like a wake-up call with not only what's happening in Ukraine and with Russia, but also the nature of the China-Russia relationship and the degree to which that partnership without limits is connected to other nefarious actors. So George Marshall said, hey, the problem is when you have the time, you don't have the money, and then when you have the money, you don't have the time. So I think we have to make some tough calls now and invest more in defense. Of course, you can get savings out of cutting waste and everything, but I think we need some significant investments to buy out that bow wave, but also to be able to conduct sustained operations. I mean, some people have estimated, I don't know these figures or I don't have any classified information, obviously, that we could expend the Pacific Fleet's ammo within a week, in a conflict with the People's Liberation Army, Navy, and Air Force. So we've economized on our defense industrial base as well. Without that multi-year budgeting, there hasn't been the predictability to open other lines. We've been purchasing the minimum of ammunition, even though we've been budgeting for the maximum, but then we cut it out so we can save money and allocate that money somewhere else. So we have some real vulnerabilities in terms of stockpiles as well as the defense industrial base to be able to make up, for example, the 6 years or so of Javelin production that have been consumed in Ukraine.
At the risk of letting this little civilian ask you a stupid civilian question that could come from the public that sees the poor performance of Putin's army in Ukraine and the effect of the haltingly given but nevertheless provided American and other allied assistance for the Ukrainians to fight the brave fight that they're fighting, couldn't one say, well, look, that army was wanted to be, Putin was supposed to have revolutionized the Russian armed forces. They were supposed to crush Ukraine within days, if not weeks, and there was not this scenario, the way it's played out, was not predicted. And just with even the halting support that we have given the Ukrainians, look what damage they have done to them. Why would the argument that we need even more when we can do so much with so little that you are just describing?
Well, I would say,
supposed to be a devil's advocate, by the way.
I would say that I think the Biden administration should get credit for giving a heck of a lot of assistance to the Ukrainians. It was halting in terms of this weapon system, but not that weapon system. And I think that that's a fair criticism. But overall, the scale of support's been significant. It's not insignificant by any means, especially when you think about the impact of even just the 2 weapons in particular, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles and Javelins had at the very beginning of the conflict, and some of the UK NLAWs and so forth. What I think has been missing is really a clear articulation of what the objectives are associated with the military assistance. And I think there are 2 fundamental objectives. Objective 1 is prevent the Russians from continuing to mass murder Ukrainians and to magnify their suffering by the attacks on the electrical grid, for example. So stop that. So if you have that as an objective, then you can inventory your assistance and say, hey, is it adequate or not? And what you really need is, obviously you need tiered and layered air defense capabilities, but you have to do more than just shoot down the arrows. You have to be able to kill the archer. So you need long-range precision fires. You also need to be able to see, deeper. So you could use like MQ-9, Reapers, for example, to be able to see into the Black Sea, into the Crimean Peninsula, for example. And you need the range, right, to be able to range those systems, like ATACMS, for example. So that now you can begin to put packages together and to think about, are you providing them in sufficient quantity, and do you have the training packages, and can these be fielded to meet that objective? Objective 2, I would say, and this would require an overarching policy decision above that, would be to help the Ukrainians develop the ability to conduct a sustained counteroffensive to regain all the territory taken from them since 2014. I mean, I think that should be the objective. That's my personal opinion. But if you have a clearly articulated objective like that, then you can say, hey, I guess they do need some protected mobility. I do think they need some mobile protected firepower in the form of tanks. They also need logistics to be able to sustain an offensive. They need engineering capabilities to get through all those minefields, and to conduct river crossings. They need, and you can begin to see the package that you need instead of dribbling out in discrete capabilities without a clear idea of how they fit in to and are sufficient or insufficient to accomplish that overall objective.
So, to bring us back to this integration of all aspects of national power, if you wish, whether you call it integrated deterrence or non-integrated deterrence, we have other elements that we have deployed in addition to our kinetic power. Or our hardware that we've provided for the application of kinetic power. We've put a sanctions package together, multiple levels thereof, with expectations of impact which have, I would argue, not really been realized, at least not to the extent that we had hoped it would be. We have talked at least, and including our Ukrainian friends have talked about the application of diplomacy to go ahead and achieve certain goals. What would you say to us about some of the other elements, the non-military elements of putting that overall application of all U.S. elements of power together? Where else do you see things that we could go ahead and take it? And also, what impact would that have on other actors who are thinking of doing similar things, such as our Chinese friends in the Pacific?
Right. Well, I think there have been some real accomplishments in terms of the sanctions packages and then getting others to sign on to them. I mean, including Japan and Singapore. I mean, it was phenomenal work, I think, that went into to getting an agreed set of sanctions on Russia with, again, an objective of ensuring that Russia could not continue to maintain its war-making machine, right? That it could, that its capabilities would atrophy over time. And of course, this is, again, a continuous interaction with opposites on the sanctions front as well. And you have to maintain sanctions. A lot of work has to go into that because the Russians are pretty good at evading them. They've learned to insulate themselves from sanctions over the years, especially since 2014. And they've been taking hints and getting help from the Chinese, but especially the Iranians as well. So the maintenance of those sanctions is something that has to be kept up. I think it is being kept up. I think another accomplishment would be the degree to which that really like-minded partners managed Putin's ability, overcame Putin's desire to use energy for coercive purposes. And they had some good luck with a relatively mild winter in Europe up to this point, but there are also a lot of some really big adjustments made to energy supply chains. This is an area where I think the United States could have done a heck of a lot more by expediting permitting and for the U.S. to export more oil and natural gas. So what's happened is, I think, mainly because of the desire to reduce carbon emissions. What's happened is nonsensical policies, right? Where instead of us pumping that oil and exporting that gas, we've supplicated to the Venezuelans and the Iranians and asked them to pump more gas. I mean, how's that helpful? And then of course, because of the shortage of gas, there's a lot more coal burning going on as well, which is actually increasing carbon emissions. So I think an opportunity is now to integrate efforts to reduce carbon emissions with an energy security perspective and through the lens of national security. And I think there's some solutions readily available to do that. And then, of course, the other area that we've become aware of that is quite significant, especially if tensions increase with China, is supply chain resilience overall, and the degree to which it's a bad idea to have single points of failure for critical supply chains that run through authoritarian regimes. And I think the administration is doing a good job assessing those supply chains, working with allies and partners to friendshore, to use the Treasury Secretary's word for it, and I think that all that momentum is really important. If you just look at really what's happened in the most recent export controls associated with microprocessor manufacturing hardware, I mean, our allies and partners went along with us, and from the Netherlands and Japan. That's, as you know, that's a lot of hard diplomatic work to make that happen. So I do think that the administration is doing a very good job in these areas. The scale of this problem is bigger than any of their man hours, woman hours that they have to dedicate to it. So it's going to be an uphill climb. But I do think that the tools of economic statecraft, including CFIUS, or the inbound investment screening to ensure that Chinese and other companies can't take small stakes or majority stakes in U.S. companies that have sensitive technologies, the outbound investment screening to ensure that we're not underwriting our own demise, export controls on key dual technology or defense-related areas is really critical. Investment in our own competitive advantages in key areas, like you saw with the CHIPS Act, areas where China is trying to weaponize its mercantilist statist economic model against us, and to compensate for that. I think you're going to have to see a lot more of that, along with what isn't talked about enough, deregulation and permitting reform. Right, it takes 20 years to open a mine in the United States, right? I mean, if you want to build a lot of batteries, man, you better open some mines. I mean, and we can get some from other sources as well, not necessarily in the continental United States, but we have to be more agile there. And then, of course, you have the human capital aspects of this. I mean, it would be great to have a debate about immigration reform in context of the national security imperative to make it easier for people to work in the United States and to get a path to citizenship. I mean, it's our greatest differential advantage, I mean, I'm at Stanford University, and I see some of my students, international students, they can't get a visa in the United States. These are like engineering grads from Stanford, and then they're going to Canada to get visas there. It's nutty. So I think that there's a whole range of human capital aspects of this as well, but all of this is, I would say, all of this is economic statecraft. And when you say, when you look at an integrated approach or strategic competence, it's how do you make sure that all these tools that you're employing are mutually reinforcing and not working at cross purposes with one another.
So I have two follow-ups to that, if I may. You sat right there at the fulcrum of coordinating U.S. national security strategy. You were the guy who had all this sort of White House imprimatur to go ahead and make this thing happen. Why are we so, and I don't mean to cast any aspersions, why are we so relatively poor at integrating all these elements which exist in our capacity but are never really sort of coming together to achieve the impact that we're seeking to gain? What's our problem?
Okay, Michael, so, it was President's Day weekend, in 2017. a Friday. I was in Philadelphia. I was briefing a report. Dave, were you there? I don't know if you were. No, it was FPRI. No, I don't think you were, but some of our friends were there. And it was a report that I had commissioned like 2 years earlier on Russian new generation warfare. So I was walking down Walnut Street, my phone rings, and it's the White House saying, "Hey, can you go to Mar-a-Lago and interview for the job of National Security Advisor?" I flew down there on a Sunday, had my first interview, then a second interview on Monday. The president hired me. I flew back on Air Force One. They had Ospreys bring me back to my home in Tidewater, Virginia, Fort Eustis, Virginia. And then I packed a bag and went to work the next day, like Tuesday afternoon. I mean, so there was not a lot of prep time. But what I was really, grateful for was the Army giving me the ability to study history and to write a dissertation that became a book about how and why Vietnam became an American war, in which I criticized McGeorge Bundy, my predecessor, several times removed, for running an ineffective national security decision-making and policy-making process. And so when I walked into that office, it was quite a strange feeling saying, okay, man, now you're responsible for that process you criticized. So I decided to at least try not to make the same mistakes. And I believe that these are mistakes that were made in the 90s as well into the 2000s. Mistake number one, spend more time. Don't underestimate the amount of time you should take to think about the nature of the challenge that you're facing, right? Think about the nature of the problem, right? There's the great Edison quote, I think, about this, right? So what we set up in the process is we set up a principal small group framing session. And we would organize these framing sessions around a 5-page paper that went to every member of the Principals Committee of the National Security Council. And then the meeting agenda was, what do you think, did we capture the nature of this challenge effectively? And that paper was organized in a way that it generated very effective discussion, and you got something in Washington that way that you never really get. You got top-down guidance. A lot of times, as you know, what happens is the NSC process is almost exclusively bottom-up. It starts with policy coordinating committees at the assistant secretary level, then they kick it up to the deputies, and then it comes in, and then you get all sorts of opportunities for satisficing behavior, lowest common denominator, and then what you get at the end, I call it policy pablum. You read these papers, they make no sense. You're like, okay, what is the nature of the problem? What is our goal and objective? Which is the second point, is that McGeorge Bundy thought it was an advantage not to have a clear goal and objective in Vietnam. Like, do you remember that? I mean, remember we studied military art at West Point. General Franklin, objective is a principle of war. It's a principle of war. So, anyway, and if you don't know where, if you don't know where you're going, any path will get you there, right? So we said, okay, we're going to make sure that we have clear overarching goals and more specific objectives as part of the framing process. But the way we're going to get those goals and objectives is we're going to answer the so what question. Why do Americans care? And we'll inventory as part of this framing paper, what are the vital interests that are at stake? How are you going to explain to somebody, in Arizona, hey, this is why this is important. This is why that we have to invest in a range of capabilities or apply resources to a particular set of challenges. So then you can view the complex challenges through the lens of your vital interests, craft the goals and overarching objectives. The other step that is skipped in Washington oftentimes is to identify the assumptions on which the planning effort is based, especially assumptions concerning the degree to which you assess you and like-minded partners have agency and influence over that challenge. Many policies and strategies are fundamentally flawed because they rest on implicit and flawed but unchallenged assumptions because they're implicit, right? Hey, China's going to liberalize. Just keep on with that cooperation and engagement approach to China. It's going to happen eventually. I mean, but that's never really drawn out in the discussion, and those assumptions then aren't tested. And then what's critical is to identify obstacles to progress and opportunities that can be exploited, which we did, and then we identified risk and so forth. But that was the discussion. Do we have the framing right? First part of the meeting. Second part of the meeting, hey, what Principals Committee, what are your ideas about how to integrate all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners to overcome the obstacles to progress and take advantage of the opportunities? Then again, you get top-down guidance. I mean, anybody who's military gets this in here, right? This is kind of, the military decision-making process. This is mission analysis, right? I mean, and commander's guidance that follows mission analysis. So then we had enough to run on. I could bring to President Trump, we had these little White House cards, just like this actually, and I would have, the bullets on the nature of the problem, the goals and objectives, the overarching goal and objectives and everything, and say, hey, we had this Principals Committee framing session. We think this is the nature of the problem. What do you think? Do you approve of this? He approved of it. Then I put out a cabinet memo, which then started to turn the ship of policy, while the Policy Coordinating Committee now is developing multiple options for the president, which was the other big lesson in strategic competence. A president deserves multiple options because he or she are the only person who got elected. So if you bring in one shiny course of action, first of all, that's not going to work with Donald Trump anyway, because he'll just do the opposite just to spite everybody. You know what I mean? So you have to bring in multiple options, and it's in the comparison of those options, the advantages and disadvantages, you can really illuminate for the decision maker what is the best option. And it worked. I think it worked. I believe in that. And I'm biased because I was there. But I think in the 13 months that I was there, we got good policy outcomes through that process. And, it was chaotic. And all the reports of, the chaotic White House and everything else, it was actually really harmonious. No, not really. It was, no, but what we did is we actually ran a process that, I just blotted out the noise. I mean, Ilya and Ilber were there with me, man. And, hey, there's a role for a mild form of stoicism, in battle and in the White House, and the key is to focus on what you can control, to sort of paraphrase Epictetus, and to play well the role assigned to you. And I'm sorry to go on about this, but I do think that the role of National Security Advisor is to do just that, to provide the president with best analysis, best information, but multiple options, so the president can decide what his or her strategy is, what his or her agenda is, and what their strategy is, and their policies. But I think there are some people who serve in any administration who confuse their role. They think that it's their job to manipulate decisions consistent with their own agenda. They don't want to give the president options. They want to manipulate decisions based on their preferred course of action. And then you have a third group who maybe cast themselves in the role of saving the country and the world from the president, right? And so, the problem with this second and third group of people is nobody elected them to make policy. So not only are they not serving the president well, they're actually undermining the Constitution. So I think it's really important for kind of ethics discussion around service in any White House or in any administration, and to try to make it clear to those who do have the privilege of serving there what their role is, what the role is that has been assigned to them.
I want to follow up on something that your colleague Ben Frakley taught me, because when you use the word framing, I immediately thought about another term he taught me, and that's anchoring. Yeah. So one of the things that you talk about now is the people that come in with their own agendas. Clearly, particularly the civilians in the room who did not have the rigor of your background and training to go ahead and have this organized form of top-down decision-making to go ahead and provide guidance to the rest of the policy implementation apparatus, if you wish, that many of the people would have come into the room anchored in certain positions. And how do you then overcome that, other than to say, well, I'm the National Security Advisor, do what I tell you to do, or I'm going to go to the President, and then we'll get our direction from that. I can imagine that there would have been a little bit of a trouble with that in the Trump White House.
Yeah, well, I think most people respond to positive leadership. I really think that. I mean, I think that, if you lay out the expectations for people, help them understand what their role is, how they can best serve the country, help serve the elected president, then most people will do the right thing. There will be a small minority of people who are determined to pursue their own agendas and to do so in a way that's disruptive to the mission. And that's why you fire people, I mean, and you should counsel them and try to explain to them, what a better path would be. But if they can't get with the program, I think then they have to go. One of the toxic things in the Trump White House was this dynamic, really, between people in various camps who were leaking information that was damaging, either they thought to the president, who they couldn't really conscience his election, a lot of people in the beginning, but also to people who were leaking because they wanted to disparage the national security decision-making process and policy-making process, because it was by kneecapping me, and the NSC process, they would have a better shot at advancing their agenda, you know, on trade or immigration or whatever that agenda was. So I think, you know, for me, I had a decision to make, and Illy and Ilbera helped me make it, with other really wonderful people who I had a chance to work with on the NSC staff. I could either have fought those internal battles, you know, and tried to keep my job, or I could just do my job as long as I could, and when I was used up, just be at peace with that I'd be used up. And that's really what I did. I just kind of ignored all of it and did the best job I could for as long as I could. And when I felt like I was used up, I just had a conversation with the president. I said, hey, I think I'm kind of used up here, you know, and whenever you're ready to make a change, I'm happy with it, you know, and I'll help the new person transition. I think a lot of times people don't realize that, you know, obviously the jobs that you're in when you're serving in a position like that are much bigger than any individual, right? So you know, I wanted to set up, you know, Ambassador Bolton for success when I left, and you know, I think I left on good terms with just about everybody there. Not everybody, but just about everybody.
The job being bigger than any one person would be a wonderful watchword to send out around this entire town to let everybody understand that the job is much more important than any one individual. Hats off for that. I want to ask one more question and then open it up to for you all to have a conversation with the general, so it's not just me. And I want to bring it back to a criticism that you sort of uttered against what you called an end to diplomatic restraint, and it comes back to what you said a few moments ago, when you talked about that we have to give up the delusion that restraint will appease authoritarian regimes that have made their hostile intentions abundantly clear. What you said just a little while ago, and I want to ask you: is there no instance, in your opinion, is there no opportunity for working with adversaries on issues of common interest, despite the differences that we have? The obvious things being, you know, Putin just said he's going to pause at least start two deliberations. The environment, various issues where we do have a certain commonality of interests, despite the fact that we aggressively argue against each other's positions in other areas. Do you see no opportunities for that? Or in other words, that's what I understand, the delusion of restraint to appease authoritarian regimes. I wouldn't want to appease the Chinese on Taiwan, but I would want to work with them on the environment, for instance. Yeah. A few words on that, if you
Yeah, I mean, there are areas of cooperation, but I mean, good luck working with the Chinese on the environment, right? I mean, because, you know, Xi Jinping poses as like an environmentalist at Davos, you know, and builds like 80 coal-fired plants internationally, yeah, and is, you know, ramping up, coal-fired plant emissions in a way that's profoundly damaging, you know. So I think that, you know, you have to really be realistic about the nature of the regime that you're dealing with, and not delude yourself into thinking that, for example, that, you know, Russia is continuing to as we did for many years, adhere to the INF Treaty. We deluded ourselves. I mean, they were breaking it from I mean, a long time ago. We should have gotten out of that a long time ago. So I think that, you know, if you know, some of these things are so hard to get rid of, because you want it to work so badly, right? The INF Treaty was, you know, brilliantly negotiated by George Shultz. It was the first time that a whole class of weapons was eliminated. But, you know, the regime changed, you know, in Russia. And China is an emerging threat in that area. And we're putting ourselves at a profound disadvantage because we wanted to hang on to that agreement for an agreement's sake. And then also, you know, I love the State Department and diplomats, man. But I'm telling you, you know, if you're in the State Department, you're going to negotiate. It's what you do. It's like the Geico commercial, right? You're going to negotiate, and then those negotiations typically are, you know, designed to just get the agreement. And oftentimes those agreements are achieved by making concession after concession. I think an example of this are the agreements with North Korea over the years, as well as the JCPOA. So hey, I'm all for working with people, but I think it has to be from a position of strength. I'll tell you, I thought we got some nascent cooperation from Xi Jinping and China's Communist Party leadership on North Korea in 2017. Why did that happen? Because the strikes in Syria during the Mar-a-Lago summit. I think that's the biggest reason. And he thought, man, I mean, the United States might actually act to solve this problem without the cooperation of the North Korean regime, and they actually feared that even more then maybe losing the buffer in the north, or then their desire to use North Korea as a wedge against us and our allies in Northeast Asia. So I think that after I met Patrushev immediately after we killed 300 Russians in the Euphrates River Valley in Syria, and he was talking about like, hey, what can we cooperate on? I mean, and I think he realized how weak their position was there. In December 2017, we had a decision before the president on javelins, right, to provide javelins or not to Ukraine. And like all these discrete decisions, like should we get in or stay in or get out of the JCPOA, we always tried to put an overarching strategy in place that we could then take that discrete decision in context of that overarching strategy. Does it contribute to the strategy or not? So what we did is we got presidential approval for a Russia strategy in 2017, like I think by October, September, maybe even, and people forget, but I mean, in that first year of the Trump administration, we sanctioned more Russian entities in that 1 year than the previous 8 years of the Obama administration. And even though the president had this strange affinity for saying nice things about Putin and so forth, and he viewed the Russia relationship really through the lens of the Russiagate stuff that was like always hanging around his neck. So I think he which was unfounded, it turns out, but it made him kind of just not be able to disassociate what we're doing from Russia from what was happening here domestically in the media and so forth. So it was a complicated issue to bring Russia up. I mean, like, it wasn't my favorite thing to talk about. But the javelin issue, everybody had agreed, hey, we should provide them with javelins. This is really the way to bolster deterrence, and far from being provocative to Putin, actually, it could prevent a war by providing a real capability to the Ukrainians. So I brought that rationale to him in December, and he had heard from everybody already, and I just said, hey, I think it's time for you to make a decision. And I know that people are in your ear, these are some people you can imagine in his ear saying, hey, this is provocative to Putin. I said, hey, what actually provokes Putin is the perception of weakness. And I just went through a few historical examples of, unenforced red line in Syria, for example. I think you can draw a direct line from that to the invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. So I think, using some of those examples, he was persuaded, provided a package deal of the Ukrainians purchasing, I think, the majority of those systems, thus providing some under foreign military assistance.
I'll just say one last thing to defend the diplomacy, since you impugned us.
I love diplomacy.
I have practiced, and we teach in our lab, that walking away from a negotiation in disagreement is a perfectly viable outcome, one that we practice on a regular basis, meaning that if we can't agree, we're not going to agree. We're not going to go ahead and seek a diplomatic sort of end state at all costs. So no, I accept the criticism because I think it's valid. Nevertheless, most of the time we are perfectly happy to walk away from something that is obviously not in our interest. But with that, it's high time to turn it over to you and to have a conversation with the general. And I promised Ben the first one, and I'll go on to the next few. So
Ben from the ASU. I don't think I need a microphone. I'm okay. I'm good. Okay, he's going to make me. Thank you, Derek. Yep. So you've talked around it, but in all seriousness, given the size of our government, the bureaucracy of our government, and given the divisiveness in our government, is competitive statecraft, is this ability to craft a strategy and a campaign plan against the interagency actually achievable? And if it is, how do we get there?
Okay, I think it is, and I think China is going to be the test case. There's a great deal of bipartisan support across the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Like, how often do you hear that, right? And I would say also on Russia, in terms of just the concrete actions the Trump administration took and what the Biden administration is taking, there's a great deal of continuity. I think that the Iranians are going to force a great deal of continuity, in terms of the approach to Iran as well. So, I do think it's possible. And one of the good things about bureaucratic inertia is if you get a really good idea into the bureaucracy, it's going to take you a really long time to kill it. And so, for example, when we convened, the Principals Committee on the China strategy, the framing for the China strategy. We did this, we rushed this in March of 2017 because we wanted to get the framing document out and discuss it in advance of the summit at Mar-a-Lago. And I brought with me the previous administration's China strategy, and I read an excerpt, and I said, hey, I think we're about to effect the most significant shift in U.S. foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And I didn't say that to be dramatic. I think it was just a statement of fact. And I believe that happened from that moment on. There were a lot of tremendous people who helped drive that, like Matt Pottinger and others. But there was a great deal of willingness to do so across the departments and agencies, because within the departments and agencies, in the sworn federal officers who served there, they had been frustrated by previous administration's policies. They had seen the sustained campaign of Chinese espionage. They had seen the need for the China division, which was now dismantled, which I don't think should have been dismantled, but it's still going in terms of DOJ investigations of Chinese espionage, for example. The need for us to reinvigorate CFIUS, the need for really the reinvigoration of the tools of economic statecraft that you see the Biden administration applying now. The first line of the Indo-Pacific strategy, that document, which came out of that March 17 initial session, is that, hey, we have to prioritize working with allies and partners because any other approach will fail. The Chinese will use a divide and conquer approach, right? And so I think you see the Biden administration doing a great job with that, with the IPEC and the AUKUS format, and continuing to build on the Quad format. And so anyway, I think I can see it happening now. It's not perfect, but I do think that you're hitting a really important point. Is if we are incapable of crafting a long-term policy and strategy, and new administrations come in and define their foreign policy mainly as an opposition to the administration that came before it, we're going to have inconsistent policies and strategies, and the only beneficiaries of that will be our adversaries and enemies. But I think I've got hope based on what's happening with the competition with the CCP.
Yes, the gentleman right in front, and then the gentleman right behind you. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Paul Kamari from RAND Corporation. I was wondering if you could detail a bit more how the United States can pretty much advance, not only for the United States competitive statecraft, but also its allies. There's a lot about whether or not they're on paper, they say that they want to change, that they want to be more focused on defense, spending more on defense and all of that. We've just had Olaf Scholz write a piece on foreign affairs saying that he wanted the global Siitenwende and focus a bit more on defense. But we have yet to see in action if that produce all of its results. And even in Japan right now, it's contested whether or not they are going to be sustaining that effort in terms of spending more on defense and all of that. So my question to you is how you've already cited the power of our example about how we can actually try to show the example to our allies that we can do more, but what other factors do you think that we can do to try to push that momentum and not just make it stall? Thank you.
Well, I think the power of Xi Jinping's example, and Vladimir Putin's example. I mean, I would have sent him flowers, man. Boxes of chocolate. Thank you so much for waking us up, and clarifying really the nature of your regimes and the threats. So I think that the threat to Japan is very real. I mean, they're going to double their defense spending. They're going to do it. I think it's it's tough to do that so fast, but I think over the next several years they're going to really vastly expand their defense capacity, but they're going to integrate some new very important capabilities like the counterstrike capability that was highlighted in their defense strategy. I don't know what Germany's going to do. I mean, I hope that they make good on what the initial pledge was, which was to actually meet the 2% Wales pledge and then even go beyond that. I hope that they do. Germany did unilaterally disarm, and I know man, a lot of people don't like Donald Trump, but man, he was right on this one on Germany. I mean, I'm telling you. I mean, when he said to Angela Merkel, hey, what are you doing with Nord Stream 2? It's Putin's ATM, and then you're cutting all your defense spending down. And we're rotating forces, over to Europe, really with an expense that was really the equivalent of a third of Germany's defense budget. I mean, he had a point, and so I think that, he may would have delivered that point differently at times, but hey, the point was valid. So I think that, it is. I think now is an opportunity to really kind of make sure everybody our allies and partners make good on kind of the renewed pledge now that they've seen the real danger. The thing is, the countries that have very small GDPs are meeting the 2% GDP, but if Germany meets it, I mean, that's pretty significant, So I think, from a burden sharing perspective, I feel pretty optimistic about it. Thanks mainly to Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping.
Yes, sir.
I should mention South Korea, too, is increasing their investments significantly.
So I'm Charles McLaughlin from the National Defense University. So early on, you made a critical remark of the hubristic approach to RMA in roughly 20-ish years ago. But it seems to me it's kind of back. That, that there's JADC2, there's ISR strike, there's all these ideas, which aren't all entirely bad. But how should we, from your point of view, how should we be thinking about these in a historically informed way so that we don't kind of go down a path of imaginary technology hope?
Well, it's a vampire. It comes back like every 15 years in a new guy. It's strategic bombing theory in a new guise every 15 years. And so really the next war is going to be fundamentally different from all those that have come before. Believe me. I mean, look at what's going on in Ukraine. Really, man? What are you talking about? And so it's going to be fast, cheap, efficient. It's going to be a big targeting exercise. We'll be able to take the George Costanza approach to war and just leave on a high note, and everything will be fine. So I think what happens is that we see changes in the character of warfare associated mainly with new technologies, and we think these technologies will be revolutionary. Remember in the Armenia-Azerbaijani conflict here recently, drones were decisive. Well, there just isn't a countermeasure yet, right? Hey, the machine gun was decisive, and then the tank showed up. The tank was decisive, and then there was an anti-tank weapon. The bomber was always going to get through, and then there was radar. The submarine, and then sonar. I mean, so there's always these interactions. And so we tend to think linearly about the effect that technology is going to have on warfare, but then we also neglect continuities in the nature of war. And I think we ought to test all of these concepts based on how they relate to continuities in the nature of war. And I think there are fundamentally four of them. War's an extension of politics. Okay, that's Geico commercial. Everybody knows that, right? Glasgow said that. But what that means is the consolidation of gains to get to a sustainable political outcome. Hey, it's never been an optional phase in war, right? We wanted to just get the hell out of Afghanistan, Iraq. Well, hey, guess what? There's something you got to do before you leave. You got to consolidate gains. It doesn't mean you have to be a nation build. It doesn't mean you have to make Afghanistan Denmark. But there needs to be a viable state there that could in this case continue to fight modern day barbarians, on the frontier between barbarism and civilization. Wouldn't that be nice to have in place now? If we had just thought about it more long term from the beginning. And then the second is that war, war is human. And people do fight for the same reasons Thucydides identified 2,500 years ago: fear, honor, and interest. And if you neglect that, what you're doing in war, if you regard war as a big targeting exercise, you could in many ways be exacerbating the drivers of the conflict, rather than by making progress toward achieving some kind of a sustainable political outcome. The third element is that war is uncertain because of its interactive nature. I mean, don't you think it's been crazy the way we waged wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, announcing years in advance, hey, here's our schedule for withdrawing our troops, here's the exact number we're going to have here, here's what they're going to do, here's what they're not going to do, as if the enemy didn't have a say, right? So we left Iraq, and then Vice President Biden called up President Obama on the phone and said, thank you for allowing me to end this goddamn war from Baghdad, December 2010, 11? 2010, I think. 11, 10, 11, December 2011. And then, of course, ISIS is back by 2013, 14, and in control of territory the size of Britain, becomes the most destructive terrorist organization in history. So wars don't end when one side disengages. It's a continuous interaction. The war's not over in Afghanistan, right? We left Afghanistan, but there's a war still going on in Afghanistan. And then finally, war's a contest of wills. And I think multiple presidents have not done a good job of explaining, really how the risks that our young servicemen and women are taking, the sacrifices they're making, are contributing to a worthy outcome. They haven't described the strategy, with a few exceptions, that was sound and sustainable, and communicated really how we were going to achieve a worthy outcome at an acceptable cost and risk. And And so I think neglecting continuities in the nature of war is really what undermines a lot of these defense concepts.
Yes, sir.
Chris.
Here, I'll give you mine. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, General McMaster and Ambassador Polt. Excellent dialogue. Chris Howard, Arizona State University. And I love the West Point Sox. I'm an Air Force Academy guy, and we beat you all 3 times in football, so, you know.
These are rugby socks.
Ah.
And they're the collegiate national champions, in case I didn't know.
Yeah, but who won this year in the real sport, which was football? That's okay. We'll talk about that over a beer after this, H.R. Friendly rivals. So I've really enjoyed the dialogue. You and I talked a few minutes ago about our mutual friend with Chuck here, John Hillen, who wrote a piece in the National Review about China, and it's as if he read your notes on your pad about a very muscular Theodore Roosevelt, carry a big stick type of diplomacy from a point of strength. But in this idea of competitive statecraft is the idea of being strategic and strategy. And what I'm getting at here is, so I understand the criticism of how we got out of Afghanistan as a veteran like you. I understand, but I'm going to push on this a little bit about, we need to be big and strong and from a position of strength, but if we get it wrong with Russia, they do have nuclear weapons. If we get it wrong with China, they do have nuclear weapons. If we get it wrong with Korea, they do have nuclear weapons. I mean, we don't want, Europe to glow. We don't want to be, a position of weakness. I want you just to reconcile that. But also, in turn, this is my last, I promise I'll wrap it up here. To do all the things in Iraq, do all the things in Afghanistan, and do all the things you're talking about, layman 600, ship Navy wouldn't be enough. We'd need 12,000 ships. We need a military, budget. It would be $17 trillion. I don't know, HR. We have the money to do all of that, and it just feels like, is that strategic though? Don't we need to pick a little bit of one to do a little bit more of the other? I'm just curious.
Okay, so you're bringing some good points, but what I would say is, from defense capabilities, one of the reasons why we're concerned about the potential of nuclear escalation is because there's a conventional war in Europe. What if Ukraine's conventional capabilities had been sufficient to deter that war to begin with? We wouldn't be talking about the threat of nuclear war. And I think that is analogous to maybe the threat to Taiwan as well. So if Taiwan is indigestible from the point of view of the Chinese, then I think there's a good shot that the PLA doesn't try to take Taiwan by the use of force. So I do think deterrence is never foolproof. But I do think conventional capabilities, for example, like long-range fires. I believe that long-range fires in the hands of the Ukrainians, conventional fires, may be the best deterrent to nuclear escalation available, right? Because if they were to use if they were able to strike back conventionally into Russia, if there was the use of a tactical nuclear weapon, then Russia would have to think twice about it, right? I think it's also part of our ability to deter Russia as well. We can say to Putin, if you use a nuclear weapon, it's a suicide weapon, and we don't have to use nuclear weapons to respond. So I think these capabilities aren't just in discrete baskets. In terms of overcommitment and overstretch, Afghanistan was at a sustainable level of effort. Even if you say it was 10,000, it was down to 3,000 by the end, but we had already signed the surrender agreement to the Taliban, where we weren't going to mess with them if they didn't mess with us, and we hung out our Afghan allies to dry in a really unconscionable way. But if we were going to leave Afghanistan, we should have just left it. What we did is that we actually delivered blow after blow against the Afghan government. We actually partnered with the Taliban against the Afghan people, I would say, even at the end, because we prioritized getting the hell out of there over everything else. And we engaged in real self-delusion about the nature of that enemy. And so, do women's rights matter to anybody in this room? The administration talks a great game on women's rights, but it consigned the women of Afghanistan to hell. And it would have, it would have been sustainable in my view to have 10,000 troops there enabling the Afghans military support to the tune of $22 billion a year. I think that President Biden and President Trump both viewed Afghanistan through the lens of Afghanistan 2010, 11, 12, 9, 10, 11, 12. And they never revived, it was a much different war by the end. And of course, Afghanistan was still going to be a violent place. As I mentioned, it's not going to be Denmark, but it doesn't need to be Denmark. It just needed to be Afghanistan. And then if you look at the South Korea analogy, look at South Korea in 1953, right, at the signing of the armistice. It was an ugly situation, right? It was a country completely denuded and ravaged by war and brutal occupation. You had an illiterate population, a corrupt government, a hostile neighbor. It didn't look pretty, man. And it took a long time. I mean, it took till the 70s to have real economic reforms, and into the 80s to have real political reforms, such that now you have the 5th largest economy in Asia. And so, and it's quite a stark contrast, right, between the south of the 30th parallel and north of the 30th parallel. So, I mean, was that nation building? Well, I would say the South Koreans built their nation, right? We didn't need, and we weren't engaged in nation building. We shouldn't have been in Afghanistan. We did a lot of stupid things over the years there. I mean, I could go off on that, but anyway. But I think it was a sustainable level of commitment. And by the way, we're still in northeastern Syria, and we're still in Iraq. And even though we said we're ending combat operations, ISIS is still resurgent there. I mean, I think how many people are in that prisoner camp there? Families and terrorists, like 80,000 or something. I mean, there are a lot of unresolved issues. And we know if we leave, it doesn't get better, right? There's always a next iteration. And I think wherever we've disengaged, even Somalia, right? We disengaged from Somalia, and the whole situation turned south. We re-engaged. Much different situation in Somalia right now, in terms of terrorists really on the ropes. I think, based on our re-engagement with indigenous forces there.
Yes, sir, right there.
Hi, Gordon Newbold from the Wall Street Journal. How you doing? Thanks for the event. You touched on the defense industrial base earlier. This is going to sound like a rhetorical question. It's not. Do you think that the constraints of the base and of the government to kind of support the base is a strategic problem that they are figuring out how to solve, and to back up and say that, like, the war in Ukraine has obviously put into sharp relief the problems with the base. But then when it comes to trying to arm Taiwan in a reasonably quickly, timely way, they're $19 billion behind in deliveries. Do you think it's a problem? But also, who's to blame?
Yeah. Well, it's a problem, and I think we're to blame across multiple administrations. Because what happened is every year, we would procure the maximum number of, or we plan to in the defense budget, maximum number of MLRS rockets and javelins and stingers. And then when it came to budget execution, because there was always demand for dollars somewhere else, they would cut that procurement back to the minimums. So we accepted risk over multiple years, and I think we got into kind of an idea that the consumption rate for ammunition would be something like it was in Iraq and Afghanistan, when I think Russia fired more ordnance in the first 3 months of the war, the renewed invasion in Ukraine, than we did in both wars, over 20 years in Afghanistan and a few less years in Iraq. So, I don't know all the constraints in terms of upstream components and various minerals and energetics components and all that, because there's an issue of the base itself and assembly lines and skilled workers and the infrastructure, but then there's also supply chain constraints that are significant as well. I don't understand the full scope of it, but I'm all about us just get it done. I mean, I think we should be Americans, not Americans. And we've had to do this in the past. We've taken too much risk. It's time for investment. It's going to take years, but it's going to take even longer if we don't start now. And there is some, as you saw in the Defense Authorization Act, there is money now to reinvigorate the base. And I'm not following directly what Raytheon is doing. Some of these companies are doing on Javelin and Stingers. So we consumed, like the bumper stickers. Hey, we consumed 7 years or 6 years of Javelin production, but that's at the old rate. Okay, so let's quadruple the rate of production. I mean that sounds simplistic, I know, and I'm not fully aware of the details.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your great discussion. HR, can you talk about competitive statecraft as applied to international organizations? We've certainly, ceded our influence in many, and China has really adopted, I think, a strategy to co-opt and coerce through international organizations. How should we just continue to abandon those, or should we re-engage aggressively to really show leadership in those organizations?
Well, there have been some wins lately, like, the standard-setting organization that China was trying to take over, for example. And I know that across both administrations, they've fought some fights within in international organizations to ensure that they couldn't be co-opted and turned against their purpose by the Chinese Communist Party in particular, and working with partners. So I do think there was a mistake the Biden administration made. Again, this tendency, right, to define your foreign policy mainly as an opposition to the previous administration. So immediately rejoining the World Health Organization, for example, which has just given up, on trying to determine the origins of COVID, because it's largely captured, by Chinese influence. I think it was a mistake. Same thing with the Human Rights Council, and I think every one of these decisions has to be made discreetly, based on, is it salvageable? Is the organization salvageable? Can you fight within it and preserve its true purpose? Or does your membership on it, when it has been fully captured, lend credibility to it that it doesn't deserve? And I think each one of those decisions ought to be discrete decisions, probably made by the president, whether to stay in or get out. And the president should have an opportunity to hear from his cabinet, her cabinet, hey, what do you think? Is it salvageable or is it not? Should we stay or should we go?
I'd like to just add one thing to this, because I completely agree to a large measure. The one thing that I would argue in favor of multilateral diplomacy in international organizations and U.S. engagement in it, and competitive statecraft as using that as part of its part of our armor in fighting competitive statecraft, is that these organizations exist, as bastardized as they have become in many instances, and HR is totally right, is because we helped create them. So I'm loath to abandon them now, simply to say because some of the bad actors have now gotten undue influence in it. We need to go back and capture them back rather than just simply cut ourselves off from them.
China seems to think they're important to China,
And it's our money.
Yeah,
That's the
there you
worst
go.
part.
There you go.
I don't know. If we cut off funding to the World Health Organization, then they would have to fire everybody, I think.
Which wouldn't be the worst thing sometimes, but yes, sir.
Yeah, HR, thanks very much. Really interesting conversation. I asked the question from the perspective of a Marine, so it's going to be pretty simple. You'll be able to follow it. But then also a Foreign Service officer for about 30 years. And along the way, I went to NDU, and I read your book and was a big fan from it. You'll remember that in 2013 or 14, I forget when it was, President Obama is famously reported to have said that his foreign policy was, let's not do any stupid shit. And you have rather eloquently detailed a whole bunch of stupid stuff that presidents have done. I'm going to skip going through some of the Trump stuff, but I think that might have set a new record for stupid, despite your excellent efforts at putting a policy process in there. But all of this has been a discussion about the executive branch. I'd like to hear your reflections on the congressional role in stupid shit. And I would start with the fact that we don't get our ambassadors confirmed until about 18 to 24 months out. How do we fix that?
Right, yeah. I don't know. So I open up to, I'm sure, Michael, you've got some ideas on this, but it's really a travesty. About a year and a half ago, I guess, I was in Panama, and we had not had an ambassador there for, I want to say, like 6 years or something crazy.
Yeah, I was the one who resigned out of Panama.
Is that right?
18.
Oh, no way.
And
Okay,
we got
yeah.
an ambassador 5 years later in 23.
Yeah, crazy.
Just showed up.
Right, and the Panamanians are like begging for an ambassador. The topic of this trip was trying to understand better how China was exerting influence in Panama, and grave concern about it, and just wanting U.S. support. So, wow, that's an amazing coincidence. Okay, so I'd love to hear your guys' ideas on how to solve that.
John's point is this question is so critical, and we talk about it. the people in the media write about it, everybody complains about it, and we keep on doing it. And it's not a partisan thing. It's being done by Democratic administrations, by Republican administrations. If we had Martian administrations, I was afraid I would be doing the same thing. It is totally outrageous, and it's unbecoming any nation of any size, of any seriousness in international discourse, what we allow ourselves. And I do not think that we have found any way to gain the consensus necessary to go ahead and actually achieve a change. And it would have to be basically a change that's enacted by one party while the other one is in power, and vice versa. Because if you try and do it as a concession, it'll never happen. So I'm afraid, John, the answer is you know that we don't have an answer, and I suspect that the outcome is going to be it's never going to change. And I wonder whether you could maybe enlighten us from the very courageous action that you took. What do you think the change could be?
I think the change has to come from the president. And I think what the president has to do, and it would have to be a president who has a pretty strong mandate, and what the president would need to do would be at the beginning of every administration, would be to cut a deal, what you and I did for our whole careers. Go to the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the ranking member and say, you get 3 holds each. For whatever stupid reason you want, because you didn't get the potholes fixed in Nebraska, or because you're ticked off about Cuba policy, or whatever. Each side gets 3, no questions asked, we have to fight with you. The rest of them, if you don't have an ad hominem reason for objecting to that individual, you got to get them through the committee, assuming they're all confirmed, they're appropriately qualified, and that may have an effect on lowering the number of Schedule Cs, but not too much. I mean, most of our Schedule Cs are actually pretty competent people with different skill sets, but that helps the Foreign Service, I believe, and it helps diplomacy. But you have to have a president who cuts a deal. Absent that, I agree with you, we're just going to keep doing the same stupid stuff over and over. But we're showing up to the fight. We talk about, are we winning China in the part of the world I know a little bit about in Latin America? My answer is, we're not even on the field. We don't even get our first-line team out there.
Yes, please.
I think
Pastor
that
Pete Romero, who
Pete
also
Romero,
speaks about it.
American Diplomat Podcast, retired Foreign Service officer. I think as long as our society and social media pays off the most outrageous statements that are being made by members of Congress, the only way you're going to, in terms of foreign policy and that sort of thing, the only way you're going to rein that in is by leadership. And that's minority leadership and majority leadership on both House and Senate. And that goes back to John's point, and that is you've got to cut a deal. You've got to cut a deal. President with a strong mandate goes to both House and Senate, minority, majority, and basically says, this is the way we've got to do foreign policy. It's got to be done this way. Because as long as you can make outrageously ridiculous statements, and all you care about as a member of Congress as in terms of clicks and how many people are watching you, and as long as that continues to guide a good chunk of Congress, it's not going to change.
I would add one more thing to that, thank you very much, Pete, that relates to what the gentleman has been talking about all evening, and that is he's addressing the issues of national security from the military perspective in a very serious and professional manner. I would challenge you to argue back to me that we treat our diplomacy in the same seriousness with which our military addresses its role in our national security structure. We never have. We never have for as long as I've been in it, 35 some years, and I do not think that we give it the kind of weight that it deserves to play the role in this competitive statecraft environment, in this integrated strategic environment, for it to be able to do the things that it needs to do, to the point where we depend as diplomats on our military colleagues going up to the Hill, making the arguments for resources and for sanity in our diplomacy better than we do ourselves. That's a pretty big gap in our overall competitive statecraft ability to go ahead and achieve national goals. We have a question. Yes, sir. And we have time for one more after that, and that's the last one. Yes, sir. Yes,
Okay,
please.
thank you very much. Really enjoyed this. Thanks for your time, your expertise, and for coming from New York today, however you did it.
Amazing.
Don Alston, retired Air Force nuclear guy, private citizen, ASU student currently. if you could, one of the cross-cutting capabilities and challenges that we have in this whole concept is competing narratives, cyber engagement, from ones and zeros, let alone narrative development. I think we're in our infancy when it comes to U.S. Cyber Command and how we face this. Your comments about failing to look at and neglecting the continuities of war. I think we got a lot of maturing to do when it comes to how to challenge this from a military perspective, but it's so much broader than just a military perspective. I'm just curious your views on how you either unpack cyber as it relates to this in terms of narratives and ones and zeros, how well integrated you think we are, and what the challenges are in that.
Okay, so as you know, like we're at war essentially, in battle in cyberspace every day, and the way I think about it are really in certain threats, but they're not really discrete. They overlap oftentimes. So I think one of the things we're talking about is cyber-enabled information warfare, and that is warfare against us. I think that is largely aimed at affecting our confidence in who we are as a people, and our confidence in our democratic institutions and processes and principles. I don't think the Russians care who wins any of our elections, as long as a large number of Americans doubt the legitimacy of the result. And so that's what they try to target, is our confidence in our democratic processes. Even during the 2016 presidential election, 80% of the Russian bot and troll traffic were on issues of race. Followed, distant second was the border and immigration, and third was gun control. So issues that are already divisive, they want to drive that wedge even further, really kind of wear down the fabric of our society and our common identity as Americans. So if you understand the nature of that threat, then I think it's important to put together a strategy to attack it, and it takes leadership from the top in this case, especially really demanding from political leaders that they no longer compromise their principles to score partisan political points in regard to election, whether you're Donald Trump or Stacey Abrams. I mean, not that there's equivalency between them, but I think anybody who is an election denier, is actually working for the enemy in this case. And then so I think there's a whole range of threats associated with cyber-enabled information warfare, and I think the biggest aspect to inoculate against that is education, so that those who are on the receiving end of that information warfare are better equipped to judge for themselves. And then, of course, you see what the Supreme Court is about to decide maybe here on the degree to which algorithms might be a cause of various maladies in our society, and to hold various social media companies potentially liable for that. That's another aspect of that problem. Then, of course, you have the offensive cyber problem to attack really critical infrastructure. And of course, what we have is a lot of vulnerable infrastructure based on the surface area that is growing by orders of magnitude with the Internet of Things and the variety of malware that is available to actors, the degree to which now those skill sets for hackers are transferable, and the tools can be used by really anybody. So I think that we are much more vulnerable to offensive cyber capabilities, which requires us to develop layered defenses in the private sector and in the public sector, but it also requires a very robust offensive capability. And I think there have been some policy changes made in recent years, much of which I think is classified, that have helped us be much more agile in recognizing that a good defense requires a good offense. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why massive cyber attacks, big effects from cyber attacks in Ukraine was kind of the dog that didn't bark. It was because of some of their offensive cyber capabilities. And then I think the other key aspect of this is the criminal element and ransomware and so forth, and the degree to that's affected us. But these now all sort of blend into one another. And the final category is cyber-enabled espionage. Industrial espionage in particular, to steal technology and sensitive information, data, personal data, the huge data theft that China's engaged in. And I think that each one of these requires a different response. And the response has to be, I think we finally got the cyber strategy out in 18, right before I left, or around before I left. That was a real nightmare to get it through just our own little bureaucracy on the NSC staff, man. Jeez. But the emphasis was on the need for us to apply tools outside of cyberspace to cope with cyberspace threats as well. And you know, I think that that's an important aspect of defending. But I mean, it's a huge question. I do hope that we can get much better at cyber-enabled information warfare, countering it. And I think we ought to go offensive against the authoritarian regimes that are coming against us by poking holes in their information firewalls and helping get alternative sources of information, to the people who are living in those in China, you know, Iran, North Korea, and Russia.
Thank you. Last question, sir.
In competitive statecraft, what voice does religion have to play? For instance, some say the Patriarch of Moscow is an ally of Putin. Others say not so fast. The Vatican has been interested in statecraft for centuries. Many years ago, General Vernon Walters told me about some of the background to the briefings that he would give to John Paul II at Reagan's behest. We have ecumenical efforts to bring sanity to the world, but we also have active efforts between Christian and non-Christian faiths to do the same. So in competitive statecraft, what role does religion play?
Yeah, I think it could play a huge role, and especially as you're mentioning, that bring people together across religions and multiple denominations, and to try to foster common understanding, you know, to help isolate, you know, extremists who try to cloak really criminal and political agendas in the false legitimacy of like a perverted interpretation of religion, for example. So I think that many of these interfaith sort of dialogue events that occur are extremely positive. You know, we made a conscious decision. The president made a conscious decision to go to Saudi Arabia for his first trip, right? And everybody was like, "What the hell is Donald Trump doing going to Saudi Arabia?" You know, I mean, it was right after, remember, the Muslim ban, you know, so-called Muslim ban, you know, executive order and everything else. So it was actually a tremendous opportunity. And if you go back to the speech that he gave, and then the speech that King Salman gave, they're really profound in terms of how complementary they were to one another. And then what we opened, we tried to have deliverables that we could follow through on there, on counter-threat finance, which is still going strong actually, but also a center for countering extremist ideologies that they opened. Remember the orb, when they were touching the orb, you know, that photo? So that was a deliberate effort to bring in religion and tolerance of religion and to do so in Saudi Arabia. Then he went from there to Jerusalem, you know, and then from there to Rome. And all of the speeches and the statements that he made were very deliberately aimed at trying to foster understanding, isolate extremists from sources of ideological support through that whole trip. So I think it could play, you know, it does play an extremely important role. The Vatican was helpful a little bit on Venezuela, as much as they could be. For example, we asked and coordinated with them on you know, trying to get Maduro to reinstate the Constitution. Didn't work, you know, but they were helpful in that connection. And then I do think it is important in a case where, you know, Russia is using the state is using, you know, the gosh, what's his name? The title, the Patriarch. To advance this, you know, this war agenda. I think it's important for other religious leaders to call them out for it, as the Pope has actually, you know. So.
Well, thank you very much, General. You just a moment ago used a magic word for anything having to do with ASU, and that's called education. And I'm grateful that you did that, because it allows me to thank, first of all, you for taking the time to speak to us today, to address this entire concept of competitive statecraft, that Ryan and Dr. Howard and Dr. Crow are putting ASU in the center of, in terms of fostering not only a conversation, but an education of all of us and of our students and of the American public to think in terms of advancing goals that are broader than tactical moves on a chessboard at any one time. And we look forward to as many of you as possible to be able to join us in Tempe at the end of next month to continue that conversation and to come up with some, we know that term very well, deliverables that go beyond just discussing or talking about these things, but actually putting some things on the table that can be done to go ahead and advance not just our national goals, but to reestablish, and I would argue it actually has existed in the past, to reestablish some sense of international world order based on some value ethical basis that we can support and that those who work with us can support and that our adversaries can actually take seriously and hopefully fear. So thank you very much for joining us tonight and look forward to seeing you. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.